welcome the third reading of the Financial Services Providers Pre-Implementation Adjustments Bill, and I would like to just echo the comments that colleagues have made to thank officials and stakeholders for the work that they put into making the legislation hopefully a success. It is true that the members of the Commerce Committee in particular worked hard under the whip of their very diligent chairperson, the Honourable Leanne Dalzell, and the work that was put in terms of the hours of sitting beyond normal sitting times for that committee reflect the desire to get the legislation as right as humanly possible so that investors aren't put through the sort of things that they've had to live through on our financial services market over the last few years. It is terrible that people lost their savings as a result of the lack of any regulation or lack of proper structure in those markets. Parliament should have regulated that sector earlier. It's good that we are finally doing so, and it is to be hoped that the legislation will serve its purpose. I also want to just pick up on a comment that Leanne Dalzell made about the attempts that the committee made to ensure that its process was inclusive. We had a suggested series of amendments from the government which came to us quite late in the piece. We wanted to make sure that people knew about those suggested amendments, and so, as Leanne Dalzell has indicated, we as a committee agreed to try to open up the process more than standing orders would normally allow for that. We got the House to authorise a process where folk who were interested could essentially stay in the loop around the work of the committee and the advice that we were receiving from officials. That is a good process. We sometimes, I think, pat ourselves on the back as a parliament a little too much about being open to public submission, because surely we are open in that way on a comparative basis, but we could always be looking to improve our processes, and this certainly was a process that did provide for greater public input and greater interested person input than would otherwise have been the case if the strict standing orders had been applied. I do, in this respect, want to say something about the supplementary order papers that have been tabled at a very late stage in the piece. Now, we always knew that there would be technical amendments coming up from the Minister to the House at the Committee of the Whole. But I've had texts and emails today saying that there's a problem with the internet as for the parliamentary website, and so people haven't been able to access the texts of the supplementary order papers. People haven't been able to make their views known at this late stage, as they tend to do via email to members directly when something like a government supplementary order paper comes to the fore. That also obviously has ramifications for MPs themselves who are relying on remote access and want to see what a proposed amendment is at a late stage. We do, if we want to be an open legislature, use new technologies to make sure that we are accessible to the public. We do need to make sure that the technologies are actually working. And I see that the clerk is making a phone call now. Hopefully that's going to do something to get the situation remedied, but unfortunately, given that we're now in the third reading, it's too late. I also just want to point to the indisputable fact that there's no justification for legislating in respect of this bill under urgency. And the example that I've just used is probably a very good illustrator of why we shouldn't be doing this sort of thing under the extraordinary procedures that standing orders allow to the government if it has a majority on an urgency motion. If we had had a bit more time so that those supplementary order papers could have been properly considered, could have been read by the public, could have had some time for input, then we might have been able to make sure and to satisfy ourselves that we weren't legislating inadvertently. I don't think any member could put their hand on their heart and say they've read thoroughly the supplementary order papers that have come in at the last moment. I certainly haven't had a chance to. There might be one member who claims she can, and I wouldn't doubt her word. But generally speaking, they aren't accessible in the way that they should have been, and they certainly haven't been to the public. Urgency for this legislation makes it worse. Sir, a word in defence of lawyers, because they've been sorely defamed by my colleague in this process. Of course, what participants in the financial services industry have had to do, faced with significant new pieces of legislation from Parliament, the Financial Advisors Act, the Financial Services Providers Registration Act, and now the pre-implementation legislation, is go to their lawyers and say, well, what are the ramifications for us of this new set of rules that Parliament's visiting on us? And it has to be said, sir, that we have in our legal profession in this country a very sophisticated profession, particularly when it comes to financial services. We're lucky still to have that level of sophistication. And it's something that will hopefully stand us in good stead going forward if we get to any sort of fruition as to the government's stated aims to have a financial services hub or industry in this country. I don't see a lot of activity or action in moving that aspiration forward. It would no doubt be a good thing, but if we are going to have it, it's going to be in part because we have those sophisticated transactional lawyers available to advise such parts of the financial services industry that are still based in New Zealand. Sir, in that regard, I just want to say a word about the approach that's been adopted by the House in this particular piece of legislation. And it was an approach that was taken by the previous government. This is a conversation I had with the previous minister when I was chairing the Select Committee in the last Parliament that heard submissions on the providers and advisors bills. I wonder why, given that many of the financial institutions that operate in New Zealand also operate in Australia, many of them are branch offices of larger entities that are headquartered across the ditch, why we simply don't in this area adopt a similar or virtually the same regulatory regime that the Australians operate. Why don't we negotiate to have some sort of joint regulatory approach with joint regulators? I understand that there's some agreement that we might take this approach in competition regulation, with the chairman of our Commerce Commission being dual warranted in respect of the ACCC. That's a very good approach. It's very sensible. It'll keep costs down for these businesses because they'll have to just have one compliance approach trans-Tasman rather than having to have one set of rules that they comply with in Australia and another set of rules that they have to comply with in New Zealand. If we take the single economic market seriously, if we want to give meaning to the idea of Prime Minister Rudd's visit next week, then this is the sort of approach we should be trying to negotiate with the Australians across the board, instead of having things like separate competition authorities, separate financial regulators, and now, for goodness sake, a separate productivity commission, a bureaucracy to be created, we're told, by this government to perform exactly the same role as its counterpart does across the Tasman. Instead, we should be cooperating much more and seeking negotiated solutions that don't expose businesses to double sets of compliance across the two jurisdictions. Anyway, sir, that's not the path that's been chosen by Parliament. The path is the one that we're debating today. I do wish the regime well, and I hope it does make a difference to vulnerable financial services provider consumers. I hope we will see an end to the ripping off of mum and dad investors. Let's hope it is a step on the way to that. And let's hope, sir, that in a couple of weeks' time at the next Private Members' Day, we'll also see the government taking a consistent approach to financial services regulation and agreeing to support my colleague Carol Beaumont's bill to regulate the loan shark sector, because that is another sector where people are vulnerable and require protection, and there's no reason why we shouldn't provide it to one part of the industry as we are today, but to deny it to the most vulnerable, as it appears the government intends to in a couple of weeks. That would be a real shame. It would be a failure on the part of this Parliament to provide the protection that New Zealand consumers deserve, and I do hope that members of the National and ACT parties will rethink their stated approach on that issue.